The instant the transmission came through, Captain Elias Rourke knew he was screwed. Attention, unknown vessel. Your actions constitute an act of aggression against the Varkari Dominion. Stand down and prepare to be obliterated. The robotic translation was cold, emotionless. Elias could practically hear the venomous growl beneath it. A dozen crimson-red warships filled the viewport, bristling with railguns, plasma cannons, and missile arrays. A real nightmare. But the worst part? Elias had no idea what he'd done. He sat back in his captain's chair, hands resting lightly on the control panel, running through every possible scenario. Had he wandered into restricted space? Tripped some automated defense system? Smuggled contraband without realizing it? No. It was worse than that. Sir? The voice of his pilot, Ramirez, was hesitant, which was never a good sign. I think I know what happened. Elias groaned. Enlighten me, before I get vaporized. Ramirez tapped a few controls, pulling up a scan of their cargo hold. A blinking red indicator stood out like a beacon of doom. Elias squinted at it, reading the identifier code. It was a crate. A simple, unassuming crate marked as human foodstuffs. And in big, bold letters, nutritional supply, meat products. Oh, come on, Elias breathed. The bridge crew exchanged nervous glances. Captain, Ramirez cleared his throat. According to the Varkari Cultural Database, consuming meat is considered an ultimate war crime. Their history is filled with wars fought over this. Eating flesh is a declaration of extermination. Elias pinched the bridge of his nose. You're telling me we just declared war on an entire species because we brought beef jerky on board? Ramirez nodded grimly. Not just any species, sir. The Varkari are apex predators, who turned vegetarian. A long silence. Great, Elias muttered. Just great. The comm system crackled again. You have 30 seconds to comply before we open fire. The crew turned to him, expecting answers. Leadership. Some kind of miracle. Elias took a deep breath. All right. Let's talk our way out of this. Sir, said Grayson, his weapons officer, I don't think they're in the mood to chat. The warships began deploying drone swarms. Hundreds of sleek, insect-like machines detached from their hulls, armed with what looked like miniaturized railguns. No pressure, Ramirez murmured. Elias pressed the comm button, channeling his best diplomatic voice. This is Captain Elias Rourke of the Independent Freighter Wayfarer. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. There was a pause. Then, the Varkari responded, their translated voice tight with restrained fury. The only misunderstanding is that your species believes it can devour life without consequence. Elias threw up his hands. It's beef jerky, not genocide. Meat is murder. You have proclaimed yourself as the butcher king of humanity. Another silence. Then Ramirez muttered, Oh, that's not gonna look good on the diplomatic records. Elias exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. All right. Fine. Let's fix this before we get vaporized. He muted the comm and turned to the crew. Ideas? Grayson drummed his fingers on the weapons console. We could jettison the crate. Show them we don't mean harm. Elias shook his head. That won't undo the war declaration. We need something bigger. Ramirez hesitated. We could double down. Elias raised an eyebrow. Clarify. Well, they already think we're monsters, right? Ramirez shrugged. Maybe we use that. Elias narrowed his eyes. You're suggesting we bluff an entire warlike species? Ramirez grinned. Exactly. Elias considered it. Dangerous? Absolutely. Suicidal? Probably. But did they have any better options? All right, Elias said. Let's sell the bluff. He unmuted the comm. Varkari Dominion, this is Captain Elias Rourke. He hardened his voice, injecting steel into every word. You misunderstand our intent. We are not declaring war against you. A pause. Elias smirked. We're offering you a chance to surrender. Ramirez coughed. Grayson's jaw nearly hit the floor. On the other end, the Varkari warships hesitated. A flicker of doubt. Confusion. We have studied your history, Elias continued, exuding pure bravado. We know what you were. Carnivores. Apex hunters. And yet you abandoned your nature. You grew weak. The Varkari commander finally spoke. We have evolved. No, Elias countered. You've forgotten fear. He leaned forward. We are human. We have consumed the flesh of creatures far more terrifying than you. We have hunted the largest beasts of our worlds. We have conquered entire food chains. And if you think we will hesitate to do the same to you, then you have already lost. A thick, heavy silence. The drone swarm stopped advancing. Ramirez swallowed. Captain. I think it's working. The comm crackled. We require time to confer. The transmission cut off. Elias exhaled, slumping back in his chair. Grayson gaped. I can't believe that worked. Ramirez let out a nervous chuckle. They actually think we're galactic apex predators. Elias tapped his fingers against the armrest. Then let's make sure they keep thinking that. Outside, the Varkari fleet held position. And Elias Rourke, accidental warlord of humanity, waited. Elias barely had time to process what just happened before the comm system crackled again. The Varkari had gone silent for a few tense minutes. Too long, really. If they were truly terrified of humanity, shouldn't they have backed off by now? Instead, their response came through, measured and oddly formal. We acknowledge your strength, the Varkari commander stated, the translator slightly lagging. But a single war declaration is not enough. If you are truly the apex species you claim to be, you will prove it. Elias frowned. And how exactly do you expect us to do that? There was another pause before the response came through, and this time, it made his blood run cold. Trial by combat. Elias had about 3 seconds to let that sink in before alarms blared across the ship. Their sensors flared with new activity. The Varkari warships shifted positions, opening up space between them. And in that space, something emerged. A war beast. Or at least, that's what Elias assumed it was. A massive, cybernetically enhanced nightmare of chitin and muscle, easily the size of a dropship, was released from the largest Varkari vessel. It hovered in the void, its multiple limbs flexing as if anticipating a kill. This is bad, Ramirez whispered. Yeah, no kidding, Grayson muttered, his hands tightening over the weapon's console. Elias exhaled sharply, trying to keep his voice steady. Let me guess. You expect me to fight that thing? You are the leader, the Varkari responded. If you truly represent the strongest species, then as Butcher King, you will face the trial. Oh, for the love of... Elias cut himself off before his frustration could get the better of him. He muted the comm and turned to his crew. Okay, I need ideas. Fast. Ramirez was already running calculations. We can't take it in a fair fight. That thing is built to kill. Grayson nodded grimly. Our ship's weapons could blast it, but that would be breaking the challenge. They want to see what you can do. Elias rubbed his temples. I don't suppose running is an option? Ramirez grimaced. Not unless you want to be chased across the sector by a species that thinks we eat people. Elias let out a long breath. All right. If they want to see what a human can do, let's show them. He activated the comm again. Fine. I accept your challenge. The Varkari commander's voice was full of anticipation. Excellent. Prepared to face the Vorsher? Elias turned to his crew. Get me suited up. 10 minutes later, Elias stood in the ship's airlock, staring at the viewport where the war beast waited for him in the open void. The Varkari had given him a small asteroid field to fight in, probably to make it fair. Or maybe just to make it entertaining. His suit, reinforced with EVA thrusters and a few last-minute modifications from Ramirez, was all that stood between him and getting shredded. He had a plasma blade strapped to his thigh, a shock pistol at his hip, and a grappling tether mounted to his arm. It wasn't much. But then again, humans never needed much to be dangerous. "All right," Elias muttered, flexing his fingers over the suit controls. "Drop me." The airlock cycled, and a moment later, he was out in the void. No gravity. No atmosphere. Just the silent, infinite blackness of space. And the monster waiting for him. The Varsha wasted no time. The instant it registered him as a target, it lunged. Despite its size, it moved unnervingly fast, its thick, bladed limbs extending, ready to cut him in half. Elias didn't wait. He kicked off the nearest asteroid, twisting his body midair, letting the monster's first attack pass just inches from his helmet. The blade arm cleaved into the rock instead, sending debris scattering. All right, agility works. Now what? The creature spun in place, using its secondary limbs to adjust, and shot toward him again. Elias did the only thing he could think of. He activated his grappling tether and fired. The hook latched onto one of the beast's armored plates, and before he could overthink it, he reeled himself in. Straight onto its back. For a brief moment, the Varkari comms filled with shocked murmurs. They hadn't expected this. Elias grinned. Good. He climbed up the beast's spine, dodging wild thrashes as it tried to dislodge him. Then, with a single movement, he drew his plasma blade and jammed it deep into the creature's neck plating. The Varsha shrieked, a soundless howl in the vacuum of space, but it wasn't dead yet. Elias barely had time to brace himself before the thing rolled. He lost his grip. The next thing he knew, he was tumbling wildly, spinning off into the void. "Shit!" he hissed, engaging his thrusters to stabilize. His oxygen readout was flashing warnings now. He couldn't afford to let this drag on. The Varsha, wounded but still very much alive, was already locking onto him again. "Think, damn it!" His eyes darted to the asteroid field around them. And then he had it. A desperate, insane, human idea. He adjusted his thrusters, angled himself downward, and dived toward the largest asteroid in range. The Varsha followed. Perfect. Elias pushed his suit's thrusters to max burn, leading the beast on a high-speed chase through the asteroid field. His proximity alarm screamed at him as he weaved between massive chunks of rock, barely dodging collisions. The Varsha, not as maneuverable, started lagging just slightly behind. Which was exactly what Elias needed. He lined up his final approach. At the last second, he cut all thrust. Momentum carried him forward, straight for the asteroid's surface. Then, at the perfect moment, he fired his grappling tether, hooking onto a passing rock, and yanked himself sideways. The Varsha? It wasn't so lucky. It slammed full force into the asteroid at lethal velocity. The impact shattered its reinforced plating. Its limbs snapped like twigs. A cloud of debris and organic matter burst outward. Elias hovered above the wreckage, catching his breath. Dead. The Varsha was dead. He activated his comms, switching back to the Varkari channel. "Trial's over," he said, his voice calm despite his racing heartbeat. "Do I pass?" For several moments, silence. Then, finally, the Varkari commander spoke. "You are monstrous." Elias smirked. "I get that a lot." Another pause. Then the commander exhaled, a low, growling sound. "The Dominion recognizes your supremacy. You have won the trial. We will reconsider this war." Elias released a breath of his own. "Glad to hear it," he said. "Now let's talk terms." As the Varkari fleet held position, reeling from what they just witnessed, Elias grinned to himself. Because for the first time in his life, he'd learned something important. Sometimes, when the galaxy thinks you're a monster, it's best to let them believe it. The Varkari fleet remained in a tight formation, their warships still hovering like silent predators around Wayfarer, but there was a palpable shift in the air. The hostility, the sheer certainty that they had been dealing with an inferior species, it had been shaken. Elias knew better than to assume the danger was over. If anything, the real fight was just beginning. The comms crackled. The Varkari commander's voice came through, strained but composed. "We acknowledge your strength, Butcher King," he said, each word carefully chosen, as if the very act of speaking them burned his tongue. "But our dominion is not ruled by strength alone." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Because from where I'm standing, I just proved I'm a bigger apex predator than your war beast." There was a pause. The commander exhaled sharply, a sound somewhere between a snarl and a reluctant sigh. "You have proven yourself formidable," the Varkari admitted. "But a single combat trial does not dictate the fate of the Dominion. The High Conclave must see for themselves. They will not simply take our word for it." Elias leaned back in his chair. "So what? You want me to put on a show for your overlords?" The commander hesitated. "In a manner of speaking." Then the hollow display flickered, showing a new incoming transmission. The source? A much larger warship, even more heavily armed than the rest. Ramirez muttered, "Oh, great. Now what?" Grayson glanced at his screens. "That's a Varkari Judicator's ship. Think of it like their version of a Supreme Court, if their Supreme Court had enough firepower to level a planet." Elias sighed. "You guys really don't half-ass anything, do you?" The commander didn't respond. Instead, the transmission connected, and the hollow display flickered again. A new figure appeared. This one wasn't a soldier. A towering Varkari female, her exoskeleton adorned with elaborate, ceremonial plating, leaned forward into the transmission. Her eyes, cold, unblinking, studied Elias as if he were something caught between her claws. "I am High Judicator HFY of the Dominion's Conclave," she said, her voice smooth but dangerous. "I have reviewed the challenge issued. I have reviewed the outcome." Elias folded his arms. "Good. Then we can skip the formalities and get to the part where you don't declare war on us." A murmur ran through the background of the transmission. "Good. Keep them off balance." Xylon did not flinch. "You assume much, human. But we do not make decisions based on a single display of strength. The trial by combat was but the first step." Elias frowned. "You've got to be kidding me. You wish to avoid war? Then you will face the gauntlet of predation." Ramirez audibly groaned. "Sir, why does every alien species we meet have a gauntlet of something?" Elias massaged his temples. "Okay. Fine. What fresh hell is the gauntlet of predation?" Xylon's mandibles twitched, the Varkari equivalent of a smirk. "The first trial tested your ability to kill." She leaned forward slightly. "The next will test your ability to hunt." The hollow display shifted again, revealing a massive, artificial biome, an enormous, shifting terrain of dense jungle, volcanic ridges, and subterranean tunnels. "You will be transported here," Xylon continued. "The rules are simple. Survive the hunt, claim your kill, and prove you are worthy of the title Apex." Elias stared at the display, then exhaled. "So let me get this straight. I'm going into that?" "Yes." "You expect me to track and kill some terrifying monster?" "Yes." "While you watch?" "Correct." Elias drummed his fingers on the console. "All right. Just one question." Xylon inclined her head slightly. "What happens if I win?" Another pause. "If you succeed," she said carefully, "the Dominion will recognize humanity's standing as a superior predator race. You will not just avoid war. You will be feared." Grayson muttered. "Well, that's a hell of a reputation to walk away with." Elias considered his options. On one hand, this was a ridiculous death trap. The Varkari clearly weren't ready to back down yet, and they were willing to push him until they got the answer they wanted. On the other hand, if he won, this wouldn't just be about avoiding war. It would be about cementing humanity's dominance in the galactic order. Elias smirked. "All right. Let's play." Xylon's mandibles twitched again. "So be it." The transmission cut out. A moment later, Wayfarer's scanners picked up a new energy surge. "They're pulling us in," Ramirez muttered. "Some kind of teleportation system." Elias cracked his neck. Then let's make history. The transition was instantaneous. 1 second, Elias was standing on his ship. The next, he was dropped mid-air, plummeting toward dense jungle terrain. His suit's thrusters flared at the last second, slowing his descent, and he landed in a crouch. The jungle was alive. Strange, chittering creatures flitted between towering trees with bioluminescent roots. The air was thick, humid, filled with an electric charge that made the hairs on his arms stand up. And then the announcement came. Xylon's voice echoed over some unseen comm relay. The gauntlet of predation begins now. A distant, guttural roar thundered through the jungle. Elias turned toward the sound, his hand resting on the hilt of his plasma blade. Game on. For the next 2 hours, Elias hunted. Or more accurately, he was hunted. The jungle was teeming with apex predators, creatures with razor-sharp claws, camouflage abilities, and way too many teeth. But Elias wasn't just surviving. He was learning. He tracked his prey by analyzing movement patterns, using their natural habitats against them. He baited one creature into attacking another, letting them weaken each other before finishing the last one standing. He used misdirection, leading one predator into a dead end before striking from the shadows. The Varkari watched. And slowly, they realized the terrifying truth. Elias Rourke wasn't just surviving. He was winning. And then, at the peak of the gauntlet, he finally faced his final prey, an enormous, reptilian beast with armored plating and eyes that glowed with raw hunger. The Kragolith. The apex predator of this world. It charged, a thunderous force of nature, and Elias did the only thing a human would do. He didn't run. He charged back. The jungle exploded into chaos as the battle began, Elias dodging razor-sharp fangs, rolling beneath massive clawed limbs, striking with his plasma blade in pinpoint, calculated attacks. The fight lasted minutes. But in the end, Elias stood victorious. And the Kragolith lay dead at his feet. The jungle was silent. Then, the Varkari's comms reactivated. High Judicator Xylon spoke, her voice carrying something new. Something the Varkari had never spoken with before. Fear. You are no mere butcher, she whispered. Elias wiped the blood from his blade, looking up at the distant, unseen cameras. You're damn right I'm not. The jungle was eerily silent. Elias stood over the massive, lifeless form of the Kragolith, his chest heaving from exertion. His suit's oxygen supply flashed warnings, his arms ached, and his body was screaming for rest. But he wasn't done yet. He activated his comms. Judicator, he said, voice steady despite the exhaustion creeping in. Is that enough? For a moment, there was no response. Then, the transmission crackled back to life. High Judicator Xylon's voice came through, and for the first time since this insanity had started, there was no arrogance in it. No challenge. No condescension. Only quiet acceptance. You have passed the gauntlet. Elias smirked. Glad to hear it. Now let's talk about how you don't start a war with humanity. The jungle around him shimmered as the Varkari transport beam engaged. In an instant, he was back aboard the Judicator's ship, standing in a ceremonial hall surrounded by towering Varkari warriors, their eyes locked onto him with a mixture of wariness and something that could only be described as awe. Xylon stood before him. She studied him carefully, her mandibles twitching in thought. You are unlike any creature we have faced before, she admitted. Your tactics, your aggression, your refusal to accept death, even when faced with overwhelming odds. Elias folded his arms. Yeah, we humans have a bad habit of not staying dead when people expect us to. Xylon's mandibles flared slightly. And that is what makes you dangerous. She turned to the assembled warriors. The Dominion has ruled through strength, she announced. We have seen empires rise and fall, civilizations reduced to dust. But never have we encountered a species that wields intelligence and instinct so ruthlessly. The warriors muttered among themselves. Xylon looked back at Elias. The Conclave has reached a decision. The room fell into complete silence. Elias raised an eyebrow. And? Xylon took a step forward. The Dominion will not make war with humanity. A collective murmur rippled through the warriors, but none voiced dissent. Elias exhaled slowly. Smart choice. But, Xylon added, eyes narrowing, we will never see your kind as prey. Elias smirked. Good. Because we aren't. There was a long, tense pause before Xylon did something unexpected. She bowed. A shallow bow, but a bow nonetheless. The assembled warriors followed suit. The Varkari, the species that had once sought to eradicate him for the crime of eating meat, now bowed to him as an equal, perhaps even something greater. Elias let the moment settle before speaking again. All right, he said, clapping his hands together. Now that we're all friends, let's talk about something really important. Xylon tilted her head. And what would that be? Elias grinned. You have to try barbecue. Xylon stared at him. The silence was so absolute that, for a moment, Elias thought he'd actually broken their brains. Then, finally, she sighed. Humans, she muttered, shaking her head. Elias just laughed. The war was over. Humanity had won. And the galaxy would never look at them the same way again.